Can you fix something the whole world believes belongs to someone else? The little girl's voice was so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the steady rattle of rain on the corrugated metal roof. Yet every mechanic inside the community garage somehow heard it. Air compressors hissed. Wrenches clinked against concrete. A country song drifted from an old radio balanced on a dusty shelf. Then everything seemed to slow as 10-year-old Maya Carter stepped through the open bay door, clutching a small homemade machine wrapped inside a faded blue towel and a torn sheet of engineering paper folded so many times its edges had become soft as fabric. Water dripped from the sleeves of her oversized hoodie onto the cracked floor, while she searched the crowded shop until her eyes settled on one man kneeling beside an aging pickup truck. Malcolm Reed, a black single father with grease-darkened hands and tired eyes, tightened one final bolt before wiping his fingers across a worn shop rag. His work shirt carried years of faded oil stains, and his toolbox looked older than some of the apprentices who occasionally wandered through the garage hoping to learn a trade. To most people he was simply the quiet mechanic who fixed brakes, replaced water pumps, and never complained. To Malcolm, another long Tuesday meant another paycheck barely large enough to cover rent, groceries, and his 12-year-old son Eli's school expenses. "Hey!" the girl whispered again, taking 2 careful steps forward. "Can you fix it?" Before Malcolm could answer, Graham Voss, the white owner of the garage, glanced over from the office doorway with an exaggerated sigh. "Sweetheart," he called with a smile polished by years of pretending kindness. "We work on real repairs here. Cars, trucks, things that matter." A few customers offered polite smiles before returning to their conversations. Maya lowered her head, holding the bundle tighter against her chest. Malcolm noticed she never argued. She simply waited. There was something about children who waited instead of demanding that always reminded him of people who had already learned disappointment too young. He stood slowly, walked toward her, and crouched, until they were eye level. "Let's see what you've got," he said gently. Graham frowned. "Malcolm, you've got 3 vehicles behind schedule." Malcolm nodded without looking back. "They'll still be here in 10 minutes. Graham muttered something under his breath and disappeared into the office. Maya carefully unfolded the towel. Inside rested a palm-sized mechanical model built from inexpensive plastic gears, thin aluminum brackets, tiny screws, and what looked like pieces salvaged from old electronics. One shaft had snapped clean through. A small gear was missing 2 teeth. The wiring had partially melted near a tiny motor. It looked less like a toy and more like the ambitious science project of a child who refused to stop building just because materials were scarce. "I made it for school," Maya whispered. "It stopped working." Malcolm smiled softly. Machines usually stop talking before they stop telling the truth. She blinked, unsure what he meant, but she smiled just enough for him to notice. As she unfolded the torn engineering paper beside the model, Malcolm's hand froze. Near the lower corner sat a tiny hand-drawn symbol almost hidden beneath a water stain. 2 uneven circles intersected by a short diagonal mark that resembled a narrow crack. His breathing slowed. He had drawn that symbol thousands of times over a decade ago, always by hand, always in the corner of unfinished prototype sketches. No engineering software generated it. No textbook taught it. It had never appeared in any patent filing. It belonged to someone who had spent endless nights building ideas that existed long before anyone else believed they could work. Malcolm stared 1 second longer than he intended. Across the garage, another customer had just entered. Preston Hale, a sharply dressed white engineer visiting to inspect a shipment of commercial components, casually glanced toward the workbench while adjusting his expensive watch. The instant his eyes landed on the torn blueprint, the confidence drained from his face. It lasted less than a heartbeat before the smile returned. But Malcolm saw it. So did the security camera mounted above the service bay. Preston approached with practiced warmth. "School project?" he asked pleasantly. Maya nodded. "Mind if I take a look?" Before she could answer, Malcolm rested one grease-stained hand lightly on the edge of the paper without covering it. "Let's let her decide," he said calmly. Maya quietly pulled the blueprint closer to herself. Preston's smile tightened almost invisibly. "Of course," he replied. Just trying to help. As Malcolm lifted the broken model into better light, something caught his eye beneath the damaged drive shaft. Tiny letters no larger than a grain of rice had been etched into the metal. He leaned closer until the workshop lights reflected across the worn surface. 3 characters stared back at him.
R17.
Every sound inside the garage suddenly seemed farther away. Rain struck the roof. An impact wrench echoed somewhere behind him. But Malcolm barely heard any of it because R17 was the designation of a prototype everyone had been told was destroyed 12 years earlier. Malcolm carefully turned the tiny drive shaft between 2 fingers without saying a word. The letters R17 refused to leave his mind because they belonged to a chapter of his life that had supposedly disappeared forever. He placed the model gently on the workbench instead of reacting, then looked back at Maya with the same calm expression she had seen from the moment she entered the garage. "Tell me what happened," he said. She pushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It worked yesterday. Today it just stopped." Malcolm nodded. "Machines usually stop for a reason. They are more honest than people." Graham Voss stepped back onto the shop floor carrying a clipboard and an impatient smile. "Malcolm, enough playing science teacher. Mrs. Johnson has been waiting 20 minutes for her brake inspection." Malcolm stood without rushing. "I will finish both." Graham laughed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You are a mechanic, Reed, not an engineer. Leave inventions to people with real credentials." Several customers awkwardly looked away. Malcolm simply picked up a clean shop towel and wiped rainwater from Maya's blueprint before laying it flat on the bench. He never answered the insult because experience had taught him that some arguments only made the room louder while making the truth harder to hear. Preston Hale slowly walked closer, hands in his expensive coat pockets. "Interesting little drawing," he said casually. "May I see it for a second?" Maya instinctively pulled the paper closer to her chest. Malcolm smiled at her. "It is your drawing. Nobody touches it unless you want them to." Preston's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes lingered on the strange symbol in the corner for a fraction too long. "Fair enough," he replied. "Just trying to help." As he walked away, Malcolm noticed something else inside the broken mechanism. One small gear had been installed backward. At first glance it looked like a simple mistake any child might make, but after removing one tiny retaining clip with a precision screwdriver, he quietly realized the gear could not have been assembled that way by accident. Someone had intentionally reversed it. If repaired by ordinary methods, the model would operate for less than 10 seconds before overheating. Malcolm had once used that exact hidden flaw years earlier to determine whether another engineer truly understood the design or merely copied it. His heartbeat slowed again. Maya watched him closely. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Malcolm smiled. "Yes, but I would rather teach you how to fix part of it yourself." Her shoulders relaxed. He handed her a small roll of blue masking tape and showed her how to label each tiny part before removing it. "Every piece deserves to find its way home," he explained. She followed every instruction with careful concentration. Across the garage, Graham shook his head in disbelief. "He is wasting company time teaching arts and crafts," he muttered. Just then, the front door opened again. A 12-year-old boy carrying a backpack stepped inside after school. Eli Reed smiled when he saw his father, but the smile faded after hearing Graham's next comment. "Some people spend their whole lives pretending they could have been more than mechanics." Eli looked toward Malcolm, waiting for a reaction. Malcolm only met his son's eyes and quietly said, "Do not let someone else's opinion become the way you measure yourself." Eli nodded, although disappointment still lingered across his face. Malcolm returned to the tiny machine. With Maya watching beside him, he reversed the hidden gear, replaced the damaged shaft with a carefully machined spare from an old parts drawer, and secured every fastener exactly where it belonged. He never rushed. He never showed off. When everything was ready, he invited Maya to press the power switch herself. The little motor hummed softly. The gears turned smoothly for exactly 3 seconds. Then the machine stopped and produced 3 evenly spaced clicks. Click, click, click. Malcolm slowly closed his eyes. He knew that sound. He had designed that warning sequence himself more than a decade ago, and it had never appeared in any public blueprint. Across the room, Preston stopped walking. Without realizing anyone could hear him, he whispered into his phone, "The blueprint still exists." Malcolm looked up just in time to see Preston quickly lower the phone and force another polite smile. And for the first time in 12 years, Malcolm understood that the past had not stayed buried nearly as deeply as everyone wanted him to believe. Malcolm watched Preston slip the phone back into his pocket as though nothing unusual had happened. The engineer smiled politely, nodded toward Graham, and walked outside into the fading afternoon light. Most people inside the garage returned to their own conversations, unaware that a single whispered sentence had changed the weight of the room. Malcolm did not chase him. He had learned years ago that people often revealed more by believing no one had noticed them. Instead, he turned back to Maya and gently slid the repaired model toward her. "Go ahead," he said. "Try it one more time." Maya pressed the switch. The little machine hummed again, smoother than before. The gears rotated quietly before stopping on their own without overheating. She looked up with the kind of smile children wear only when disappointment unexpectedly becomes hope. "It works," she whispered. Malcolm shook his head with a warm smile. "No. It is beginning to work. There is always another improvement waiting." Maya carefully folded the blueprint again, but Malcolm noticed she held it differently now, protecting the corner with the strange symbol. "Where did you get this drawing?" he asked as casually as he could. She hesitated for several seconds before answering. "It was inside an old storage box at my grandpa's house. I used the back because I needed paper for my science project." Malcolm felt a quiet chill despite the warm air drifting through the open garage doors. "Did anyone tell you what it was?" Maya slowly shook her head. "Mom said it looked like old engineering papers and that I could use it if I wanted." Before Malcolm could ask another question, a black sport utility vehicle rolled smoothly into the parking lot. It stopped near the service entrance, and a professionally dressed woman stepped out carrying a tablet and a phone. She moved with calm confidence instead of unnecessary urgency, the kind of person accustomed to making important decisions every day. Maya immediately brightened. "Mom!" Naomi Carter smiled the moment she saw her daughter, although the smile softened into curiosity when she noticed the repaired machine on Malcolm's workbench. "I hope she was not bothering anyone," she said politely. Graham hurried forward before Malcolm could answer. "Not at all. Just a little misunderstanding. We were explaining that this is an automotive garage." Malcolm quietly interrupted without changing his tone. "Your daughter built something impressive." Naomi looked at the small machine more carefully. "You repaired it?" Malcolm nodded once. "Mostly she repaired it. I only showed her where to begin." Naomi seemed surprised by the answer. Maya lifted the model proudly. "He let me do part of it myself." Naomi smiled at Malcolm with genuine appreciation. "Thank you. Most adults would have simply taken it away and finished it for her." Malcolm shrugged. "If she does not learn why it works today, someone else will always have to fix it tomorrow." Naomi studied him for a brief moment, sensing that he spoke from experience rather than philosophy. Then Maya pressed the switch once more. The tiny motor turned. 3 evenly spaced clicks echoed softly through the garage. Click, click, click. Naomi's expression changed almost instantly. It was subtle enough that only Malcolm noticed. She looked at the model again, then at the folded blueprint. "Where did that sound come from?" she asked. Malcolm answered honestly. "The design produced it." Naomi frowned slightly. "That warning sequence sounds familiar." Preston, who had not driven away after all, suddenly reappeared beside the entrance with surprising speed. "Coincidence?" he said with a pleasant laugh. "Mechanical devices make all sorts of noises." Naomi looked toward him. "I did not know you were here, Preston. Just checking supplier inventory," he replied smoothly. Malcolm remained silent while Naomi picked up the model for a closer look. She turned it over, examining the repaired drive shaft before handing it back to Maya. "What is your name?" she asked Malcolm. "Malcolm Reed." For the first time all afternoon, Naomi paused as though the name itself had touched a memory she could not quite reach. She searched his face for another second before quietly saying, "I feel like I have heard that name somewhere." Preston answered before Malcolm could speak. "Probably not. He has worked around garages for years." Malcolm offered no correction. Naomi thanked him again, took Maya's hand, and began walking toward the vehicle. Just before opening the passenger door, Maya turned around and waved. Malcolm raised one grease-stained hand in return. As the vehicle pulled away, Naomi glanced once more at the folded blueprint resting on her daughter's lap. She could not explain why the small symbol in the corner seemed strangely familiar, but somewhere deep inside the headquarters of the company she led, an old engineering archive carried the same forgotten mark, and before the sun set that evening, she quietly instructed her assistant to retrieve every document connected to one forgotten prototype identified by two simple characters that had not crossed her desk in years. R-17. The garage felt strangely quiet after Naomi and Maya disappeared around the corner. Graham returned to his office pretending nothing important had happened, but Malcolm noticed him glance twice toward the security monitor. Mounted above the service bay, Eli finished sweeping metal shavings into a dustpan before walking beside his father. "Dad," he asked softly, "why did that engineer look scared when he saw the drawing?" Malcolm placed a wrench back into its drawer before answering. "Sometimes people become uncomfortable when they recognize something they thought was gone forever." Eli waited for more, but Malcolm simply closed the toolbox and smiled. "Finish your homework tonight. Leave old mysteries to old mechanics." The answer sounded simple, yet Malcolm himself could not stop thinking about the symbol or the letters etched into the tiny shaft. Long after the customers had gone home and the evening sky faded into deep blue, he remained alone inside the garage. He carefully unfolded a small black notebook from the bottom compartment of his toolbox. The cover was worn smooth from years of use. Inside were pages filled with sketches, measurements, handwritten calculations, and tiny symbols almost identical to the one Maya had unknowingly carried into the shop. Malcolm rested his hand on one page without turning it. He had not opened that notebook in years. Quiet dignity sometimes required leaving painful victories and painful defeats in the past. His telephone buzzed across the workbench, interrupting his thoughts. It was an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it before finally answering. "This is Malcolm." A calm voice replied. "This is Naomi Carter. I hope I am not calling too late." Malcolm looked at the clock on the wall. "No, ma'am." Naomi hesitated for a brief moment. "I have been thinking about what happened today. Maya cannot stop talking about the way you helped her instead of doing the work for her." Malcolm smiled to himself. "She did more than she realizes." Naomi continued carefully. "There is something I wanted to ask." The clicking sound from that little machine. "Have you heard it before?" Malcolm looked down at the notebook resting beneath his hand. "Yes." "Where?" she asked. He answered honestly without explaining everything. "A long time ago." Silence settled between them for several seconds. Naomi finally spoke again. "Would you be willing to visit one of our engineering facilities tomorrow afternoon? We have a mechanical problem that nobody has been able to explain. I would appreciate another opinion." Malcolm frowned slightly. "I repair trucks for a living." Naomi answered immediately. "That is exactly why I am calling you instead of another executive." Before Malcolm could respond, another voice entered the call in the background. "Preston." His words were faint but clear enough to understand. "Naomi, that is unnecessary. We already have specialists handling the issue." Naomi lowered the phone for a moment, then returned. "The invitation still stands if you are available." Malcolm accepted only after one condition. "If I come, I am coming to look at the machine, not to argue with anyone." Naomi replied, "That is all I am asking." After the call ended, Malcolm quietly closed the notebook without showing it to anyone. The following afternoon, he borrowed an older pickup truck from the garage because his own vehicle needed a new alternator. Eli climbed into the passenger seat after school. "Can I come?" he asked hopefully. Malcolm shook his head with a gentle smile. "Not today. I need you to help Mrs. Johnson feed her dogs while she visits her sister.
Eli laughed.
You always have another job for me. Responsibility grows the same way engines do, Malcolm answered. One small part at a time. Eli climbed out, waving as his father drove away toward the glass headquarters that overlooked the city. The polished building reflected the afternoon sun like a mirror, standing in sharp contrast to the weathered brick garage Malcolm had called home for years. Inside the lobby, polished marble floors echoed beneath every step. Receptionists greeted visitors by name. Large photographs celebrated innovation, leadership, and breakthrough engineering. Malcolm quietly studied each display until one framed photograph stopped him completely. It showed a product launch from 12 years earlier. Executives stood smiling around the first production prototype. Preston Hale stood proudly in the center. Malcolm looked closer. The machine displayed in the photograph carried the unmistakable shape of the design he once believed had disappeared forever. Before he could step nearer, a young engineering assistant approached him with a polite smile. Mr. Reed, Miss Carter is waiting for you upstairs. Malcolm followed her toward the elevator without saying another word, unaware that 2 security cameras silently recorded his arrival while, several floors above, Preston watched the same live video feed and quietly whispered to himself, he was never supposed to walk back into this building. The elevator doors opened onto a floor so quiet that Malcolm could hear the soft hum of climate control hidden behind polished walls. Every surface reflected precision. Glass conference rooms overlooked the city skyline. Prototype displays stood beneath carefully focused lights. Yet despite the expensive surroundings, Malcolm's attention stayed on details most visitors would never notice. A maintenance cart had left faint wheel marks near one laboratory entrance. A ventilation panel had recently been removed and replaced. One emergency cooling alarm carried a fresh inspection sticker dated only 3 days earlier. Machines always left honest footprints if someone knew where to look. Naomi greeted him outside a secure engineering lab with a firm handshake. Thank you for coming. Malcolm nodded politely. You said you had a mechanical problem. Before she could answer, Preston approached wearing a welcoming smile that never reached his eyes. Mr. Reed, he said, I hope we are not taking too much of your valuable garage time. Malcolm simply replied, every machine deserves the same attention, no matter where it sits. Preston gestured toward a large enclosed test platform surrounded by engineers studying computer screens. At its center rested a compact drive system connected to sensors and electric motors. We have experienced occasional heat spikes during endurance testing, Preston explained. Nothing serious. We only thought another perspective might be interesting. Malcolm did not move toward the machine. Instead, he stood quietly several feet away. He listened. Cooling fans cycled every few seconds. Bearings rotated smoothly. Then, beneath the ordinary sounds, he heard an almost invisible vibration that lasted less than 1 second before disappearing. Naomi noticed he had not touched anything. Do you need the design files? She asked. Malcolm slowly shook his head. Not yet. He walked around the platform once, stopping near the rear housing. Instead of examining the motor first, he looked at the maintenance log clipped beside the machine. The last inspection listed every replacement component except one inexpensive thermal spacer worth only a few dollars. Malcolm crouched beside the housing and gently placed 2 fingers against the outer casing. Do not start it again, he said quietly. Preston laughed. It has completed dozens of test cycles. Malcolm remained calm. That is exactly why I would not start it again until everyone steps back. Several younger engineers exchanged uncertain glances. Naomi looked directly at Malcolm. Explain. He pointed toward a narrow seam hidden beneath a cable harness. Heat is collecting here because something inside is compensating for a missing balance point. The system is surviving, not operating correctly. Preston folded his arms. You reached that conclusion without opening the assembly? Malcolm nodded once. Open the rear access cover. One technician removed 6 bolts and carefully lifted the panel. Inside, every major component appeared perfectly clean. Preston smiled confidently. Everything looks exactly as expected. Malcolm pointed toward a tiny spacer no thicker than a coin. That piece is carrying stress it was never designed to carry. The technician measured it. The reading immediately exceeded the acceptable specification. Naomi looked at Preston. Why was that not in yesterday's report? Preston answered smoothly. Because it is insignificant. Malcolm finally looked directly at him. Small parts decide whether people get home safely. They are never insignificant. Naomi ordered the test suspended until the engineering team completed a full inspection. Preston objected politely. Halting production over one observation sends the wrong message. Malcolm answered before Naomi could respond. Continuing without understanding the cause sends a worse one. As technicians continued examining the assembly, Malcolm noticed a tiny circular mark drilled into the inner housing. Most people ignored it because it had been painted over, but the outline remained visible beneath the coating. He leaned closer without touching it. Years ago, he had placed temporary thermal sensors through identical openings while testing early prototypes. No production version should have contained that feature. Naomi saw him staring. What is it? Malcolm answered carefully. Someone removed a sensor and covered the opening. Preston spoke almost immediately.
Impossible.
That location has never held a sensor. Malcolm slowly turned toward him. Interesting. Preston frowned. Why? Malcolm's voice remained steady. Because I never told anyone where the opening was. The laboratory became completely still. One young engineer quietly looked from Malcolm to Preston, then back to the painted housing. Naomi did not speak for several long seconds. She simply looked at the tiny covered hole, then at Preston's face, realizing he had recognized a detail before anyone had officially identified it. At that exact moment, a junior engineer hurried through the laboratory doors carrying a tablet. Ms. Carter, she said, slightly out of breath. Information technology just reported someone is attempting to access archived prototype files from 12 years ago using executive authorization. Preston's expression remained composed, but for the second time in less than 24 hours, Malcolm watched confidence disappear from his eyes before the smile returned. No one spoke for several seconds after the message from information technology reached the laboratory. The engineers looked toward Naomi, waiting for instructions, while Preston folded his hands behind his back with practiced composure. Naomi accepted the tablet from the junior engineer and quietly read the alert twice before lifting her eyes. Who authorized the archive request? She asked. The system shows executive credentials, the young engineer replied, but the access originated from a remote workstation inside the building. Preston answered before anyone else could. Old archives are requested all the time. There is probably nothing unusual about it. Malcolm did not disagree. He simply watched. Years of repairing machines had taught him that the first person to explain a problem before anyone asked often knew more than everyone else. Naomi turned toward Malcolm. Would you come with me? She asked. Preston forced another pleasant smile. Surely there is no need to involve an outside visitor in an internal information matter. Naomi answered calmly. He is already here because I asked for another perspective. I would like him to keep observing. They walked together through a quiet hallway toward a secure records room, while several members of the engineering staff followed at a respectful distance. Inside, shelves held decades of carefully preserved project binders alongside climate-controlled digital storage equipment. A systems analyst met them at the entrance. The attempted download stopped before completion, she explained. However, someone specifically searched for one archived project.
R17.
Naomi slowly looked toward Malcolm. He remained expressionless. Can you recover the search history? She asked. The analyst nodded. Yes, but some associated files were marked for permanent deletion years ago. Malcolm quietly stepped closer to one monitor without touching the keyboard. He studied the list of file names scrolling across the screen. One incomplete entry immediately caught his attention. It read, M. Reed Field Revision. Everything after those words had been erased. Malcolm spoke almost to himself. They changed the name. Naomi looked at him. How do you know there was more? Malcolm pointed toward the numbering sequence beside the file. Because this archive counts revisions automatically. If this is revision 12, revisions 1 through 11 should also exist. They do not disappear by accident. The analyst looked surprised before checking another directory. He is right, she admitted. The numbering jumps. Preston gave a quiet laugh. Old databases become corrupted over time. Malcolm shook his head gently. Corrupted files leave random gaps. This pattern is selective. Naomi remained silent while the analyst continued searching. Finally, another small window appeared, containing metadata that had survived even though the document itself was missing. The original creator field displayed only one initial before stopping abruptly. M. A modified entry beneath it listed a different creator. P. Hale. The room became noticeably quieter. Preston immediately stepped forward. Metadata can be rewritten during software upgrades. Malcolm did not argue. It can, he agreed. That is why metadata alone proves nothing. Naomi noticed something different in his answer. He was refusing to accuse anyone without evidence. That restraint carried more weight than certainty. The analyst continued examining backup records until another unexpected detail appeared. There is a thumbnail preview, she said. The document itself is gone, but a low-resolution image was never deleted. The faded preview filled only a small corner of the monitor, yet one tiny handwritten mark remained visible despite the poor quality. 2 uneven circles crossed by a short diagonal line. Naomi stared at the symbol, then remembered the corner of Maya's blueprint resting on her kitchen table. It was identical. Preston slowly stepped backward. Coincidence, he said quietly. Malcolm looked at the tiny image for several long moments before speaking. No engineer places the same hand-drawn mark on 2 unrelated projects by chance. Naomi turned to the analyst again. Create secure copies of everything that still exists. Do not alter a single file. Already started, the analyst answered. Before anyone moved, another notification appeared on the screen. A legal hold request had just been submitted from the corporate legal department ordering immediate restriction of all access to the archive. Naomi frowned. I did not authorize that. The analyst looked uneasy. The request was signed electronically by Martin Kessler. Malcolm recognized the name only because Preston had mentioned the company's chief legal officer during their earlier conversation. Naomi slowly folded her arms. Interesting timing. Malcolm quietly nodded. Machines fail at predictable moments. People usually do the same. As everyone stood in thoughtful silence, Naomi reached into her bag, removed her telephone, and made a single call. Martin, she said when the line connected. I think it is time we talked about a project that someone worked very hard to make everyone forget. Martin Kessler arrived less than 15 minutes later carrying a slim leather portfolio instead of the urgency everyone expected. His suit was perfectly pressed. His voice remained steady. His smile suggested confidence earned from years of resolving difficult corporate disputes. Yet the moment he entered the archive room, his eyes settled on Malcolm for the briefest instant before returning to Naomi. It lasted less than a second, but Malcolm noticed it. Machines were not the only things that revealed themselves through tiny movements. You wanted to see me, Martin said calmly. Naomi placed the tablet on the conference table between them. Someone attempted to retrieve files connected to R17. Then a legal hold appeared under your authorization. I would like an explanation. Martin opened his portfolio without hesitation. The legal hold was precautionary. Whenever archived intellectual property becomes active, our department automatically protects sensitive materials until ownership questions are clarified. Naomi listened carefully. Did you personally request it? Martin paused just long enough for the room to notice. Yes. Naomi nodded once. Why today? Martin answered smoothly. Because information technology notified my office this afternoon. Malcolm quietly looked toward the monitor displaying the archive history. That is interesting, he said. Martin turned toward him. Why? Malcolm spoke with the same calm voice he used inside the garage. The legal request was time-stamped 6 minutes before Information Technology reported the archive search. Silence settled across the room. The systems analyst checked the records again before speaking. The timestamps are correct. Martin remained composed. Then our internal clocks are probably synchronized differently. Malcolm did not argue. Perhaps. Naomi watched both men without interrupting. She had spent years negotiating contracts worth millions of dollars. She knew that truth rarely announced itself through loud voices. It usually appeared inside small contradictions. The analyst continued reviewing backup directories, while another engineer quietly entered carrying a sealed storage box covered with dust. "We found this in the lower archive," he explained. It was labeled obsolete development materials scheduled for disposal but never removed. Naomi carefully opened the box. Inside rested old notebooks, faded photographs, maintenance reports, and a stack of engineering sketches tied together with worn blue ribbon. The paper smelled faintly of age and machine oil. Malcolm remained completely still. He recognized the ribbon immediately. Years ago he had used the same blue tape to organize prototype revisions before digital storage became standard. Naomi untied the bundle and lifted the first page. There was no signature, only careful handwritten calculations and the familiar symbol in the lower corner. "Who wrote these?" she asked. Preston answered almost immediately. "Probably one of the early development teams." Malcolm quietly shook his head. No, everyone looked toward him. "Why are you certain?" Naomi asked. Malcolm pointed toward a sequence of handwritten measurements. The calculations switch from decimal notation to fractional notation halfway through the page. Most engineers stay consistent. I only changed formats when I worked directly with machinists because the shop equipment measured differently than the design software. Several engineers leaned closer. One older technician slowly nodded. "He is right. That was common years ago." Naomi turned another page. A coffee stain covered one corner beside a handwritten reminder that simply read, "Test after sunrise. Do not trust cold readings." Malcolm smiled almost imperceptibly. "I remember writing that." Preston crossed his arms. "Anyone could say that." Malcolm looked at the page again instead of at Preston. "The stain came from my left hand because I spilled coffee while adjusting the thermal chamber with my right." Martin spoke for the first time since the notebooks appeared. "Memory is not evidence." Malcolm agreed immediately.
No.
"It is not." Then he pointed toward another page folded deep inside the stack. "The evidence is under that corner." Naomi carefully unfolded the brittle paper. Hidden beneath it rested a small square envelope sealed 12 years earlier with clear tape that had turned slightly yellow. Written across the front in black ink were 6 simple words. "Open only if final testing succeeds." Naomi carefully looked at Malcolm. "Have you ever opened this?" He quietly answered. No, she broke the old seal and removed a single folded sheet. The paper contained one complete set of handwritten signatures approving the original prototype before production. Several names appeared across the bottom of the page. Near the center was Malcolm Reed. Beside it was Preston Hale. At the top sat another signature that made Martin Kessler slowly lower his eyes. The legal approval line carried his own handwriting dated 12 years earlier, proving beyond question that he had personally reviewed documents identifying Malcolm as part of the original project long before those records mysteriously disappeared. The discovery of the signed approval sheet changed the atmosphere more than any raised voice could have. Nobody argued. Nobody reached for excuses. Even the quiet hum of the archive room seemed louder as every engineer studied the page resting beneath the glass document protector. Naomi carefully traced the line containing Malcolm Reed's signature without touching the paper itself. Then she looked toward Martin. "You reviewed this document." Martin adjusted his glasses before answering. "According to the signature, yes." Naomi continued in the same calm voice. "Then 12 years ago you knew Malcolm Reed was officially connected to R-17. Martin chose every word with great care. "The document suggests that possibility." Malcolm quietly smiled. "Documents rarely suggest. They remember." The room fell silent again. Preston stepped forward with measured confidence. Even if Malcolm participated in early development, large engineering programs involve dozens of contributors. That does not establish ownership. Malcolm nodded without hesitation. You are correct. Preston appeared almost relieved until Malcolm continued. That is why I have never claimed ownership here. Today, Naomi slowly turned toward Malcolm. Then what are you trying to prove? Malcolm looked around the room before answering. Only the truth. Those 3 words landed more heavily than anyone expected. He had not demanded recognition. He had not accused anyone of theft. He had simply refused to let a false story remain unchallenged. The systems analyst suddenly spoke from across the room. There is another backup server. Everyone looked toward her. It was disconnected years ago, but it still appears in the archive inventory. If the hardware survived, there may be additional records that were never altered. Naomi immediately authorized the search. Maintenance staff led the group down a narrow hallway into a lower storage level beneath the engineering building where retired servers had been preserved instead of discarded. Dust-covered metal racks that had not been opened in years. The air smelled faintly of old electronics and cardboard. Malcolm quietly looked around before stopping beside a steel cabinet with a faded inventory label. This one, he said. The maintenance supervisor looked surprised. How did you know? Malcolm pointed toward the ventilation slots. Someone cleaned only this cabinet recently. Dust settled everywhere else. The supervisor opened the door. Inside rested an aging backup unit still connected to emergency power. The analyst smiled with cautious optimism. It might still work. After several careful minutes, the old system slowly came to life. The screen flickered before displaying directories untouched for more than a decade. One folder immediately appeared. Original laboratory video logs. Preston quietly took one slow step backward. Martin noticed the movement but said nothing. Naomi instructed the analyst to open the earliest recording. Grainy security footage filled the monitor. The laboratory looked younger. Equipment stood in different places. Several engineers worked around the first R-17 prototype. A younger Malcolm appeared wearing ordinary work clothes instead of an executive suit. He adjusted instruments, made handwritten notes, and quietly instructed technicians assembling the prototype. Nobody in the room spoke while watching. Preston also appeared in the recording, standing nearby and taking notes as Malcolm explained each calibration step. The timestamp confirmed the footage had been recorded months before the public product launch shown in the company lobby. Naomi watched every second without blinking. Another clip began automatically. Malcolm stood alone inside the laboratory late at night, performing one final endurance test. Before leaving, he placed a handwritten notebook inside a locked drawer, secured it, switched off the lights, and walked out. The video ended. The analyst searched for the next recording but frowned. The following file is missing. Malcolm quietly answered. Someone deleted the morning after. Naomi looked toward Martin. Can deleted surveillance files be recovered? Martin hesitated. Sometimes. Then recover them, Naomi replied. Preston finally broke the silence. Old recordings can be misleading without context. Malcolm calmly agreed again. That is true. He looked at the frozen image of his younger self standing beside the prototype. But context begins with knowing who was actually in the room. Naomi slowly closed the archive folder before turning toward everyone gathered around the monitor. Beginning today, no one modifies, removes, or accesses another record connected to R-17 without my direct authorization. Every engineer acknowledged the instruction. Preston forced a polite nod. Martin quietly closed his portfolio. Malcolm simply looked once more at the younger version of himself frozen on the old screen. 12 years had changed his clothes, his career, and the building around him, but one thing had not changed at all. Even in the oldest recording, he had been standing exactly where he always preferred to stand, not in front of the cameras or beside the executives, but quietly beside the machine, making certain it told the truth. The old laboratory recording remained frozen on the monitor long after it finished playing. No one rushed to speak because every person in the room understood that another piece of the story had quietly fallen into place. Naomi looked from the screen to Malcolm, then back again, comparing the younger engineer in the recording with the quiet mechanic standing beside her. The years had changed his hair, his clothes, and the lines around his eyes, but they had not changed the calm patience with which he observed every machine. "Why did you never come back?" Naomi finally asked. Malcolm answered without bitterness. "Because I believed the work mattered more than my name." Preston folded his hands together. "Or perhaps because you chose another career." Malcolm nodded. "Life sometimes chooses first." Martin remained unusually quiet. He understood that every recovered document narrowed the space where explanations could hide. The systems analyst interrupted the silence with another discovery. "There is one more storage device listed in the inventory," she said. "It is not part of the company archive anymore. According to these records, it was signed out the week after the final R-17 review." Naomi stepped closer to the monitor. "Who signed for it?" The analyst enlarged the scanned checkout form. The signature at the bottom had faded with time, but the printed recipient name remained clear enough to read. Graham Voss. Malcolm slowly raised his eyes. Graham had owned the neighborhood garage where he had worked for years. Until that moment, Malcolm had never known the garage owner had any connection to the company that once developed R-17. Naomi frowned. Why would a future garage owner receive engineering storage equipment from this building? Martin answered carefully. Many companies dispose of retired hardware through surplus programs. Malcolm quietly looked at the date. Not 1 week after the project closed. Naomi noticed the same detail. "Arrange transportation," she instructed. "We are going to that garage." Less than an hour later, 2 company vehicles pulled into the familiar parking lot where everything had quietly begun. Graham stepped outside, surprised to see executives standing beside Malcolm. His confident smile faded when he recognized Naomi Carter. "Can I help you?" Naomi held up a printed copy of the checkout record. 12 years ago, you removed a backup storage unit from our engineering department. We would like to see it." Graham laughed. Nervously. "If I took anything back then, it would have been junk headed for the trash." Malcolm looked toward the old storage room behind the service bays. "You never throw away machines," he said softly. Graham frowned. "What makes you think that?" Malcolm smiled politely. "Because every broken tool I have ever asked for was still here." Graham hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Naomi noticed it immediately. "Would you mind showing us the storage room?" Graham reluctantly unlocked the weathered metal door. Shelves filled with old transmissions, worn compressors, rusted shelving, and forgotten equipment stretched from floor to ceiling. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight. Malcolm walked slowly through the room instead of searching randomly. He stopped beside an aging steel cabinet hidden beneath stacked tires. The cabinet carried an old inventory sticker almost completely peeled away. He brushed away the dust with one hand. Underneath appeared a faded company asset number matching the checkout record. Graham crossed his arms. "I forgot that thing was even there." Malcolm looked at the thick layer of dust covering the cabinet handle. "No," he replied gently. "You forgot everyone else knew it was there." Graham said nothing. Naomi nodded toward the maintenance supervisor accompanying them. "Open it." The lock resisted for a moment before giving way. Inside sat an aging backup server wrapped in protective plastic exactly as it had been stored years before. The power indicator remained dark, but the equipment appeared untouched. The systems analyst smiled with cautious excitement. "If the drives survived, they may contain complete engineering records." Graham quickly added, "Or nothing useful at all." Malcolm quietly rested his hand on the cabinet door. Old machines remember longer than people expect. Naomi ordered the server carefully loaded into the company vehicle for forensic recovery. As technicians secured the equipment, Maya stepped out of her mother's vehicle carrying the repaired science project Malcolm had helped her build. She walked over with the same quiet smile. "I got first place," she said, proudly. Malcolm smiled with genuine warmth. "You earned it." Maya looked at the old server being loaded into the truck. Is that another broken machine? Malcolm glanced toward the cabinet one final time before answering. Maybe. Then he looked back at her with quiet confidence. Or maybe it has simply been waiting a very long time for someone to ask it the right question.